Morning in Ridgewell Valley carried a kind of stillness, so quiet it felt as though the whole valley held its breath, waiting to see how far its people could bend before they broke. Amina Walker sensed that hush the moment she opened her eyes. The cold was sharp, but it wasn't the cold that pulled her from the thin blanket. It was the weak, rasping cough from the back room. Aunt Helen had endured another night of struggling to breathe. The small dirt house held only two women leaning on each other to survive. Amina, her hands shaped by needlework and her eyes holding the weight of too many hard years. And Aunt Helen, who had spent her life gathering scraps to raise Amina, now a frail body under a torn blanket, breath thin enough to slip away at any moment. Amina laid a hand on her aunt's forehead, feeling heat burning like open flame. The medicine bottle on the table held only a few drops. The money in her pocket could buy a single loaf of bread, and the notice of eviction, 3 months behind on rent, sat plain as day beneath the table leg. Each trouble was small on its own. Together, they rose like a wave ready to swallow what future she had left. She turned toward the window. Outside, the clouds darkened. A bad day was coming. She tied her hair with an old cloth, fastened her collar, and set to work repairing a wedding dress for a woman up north. The pay would buy her aunt a few more days. Just as the needle slipped through the thin fabric, hoofbeats rang out in front of the house. The sharp sound startled her. In this valley, strangers rarely brought good news. She stepped onto the porch. A black horse came to a stop, dust clinging to its coat. The man on its back sat straight, his long coat worn by travel, his bearing steady like someone tempered by loss. When he pulled down his scarf, his face showed cold, discipline, and exhaustion. But that wasn't what made Amina pause. It was his eyes. Only a brief look, but heavy, as if he weighed something far beyond her understanding. "Miss Amina Walker?" His voice was low, clipped, but not rude. "Yes, that's me." He dismounted and gave a slight nod, a simple gesture, free of arrogance. "I'm Ethan Hale from Langford Estate. My employer instructed me to deliver this letter to you. He says, time is short, and the matter must be settled soon." He handed her an envelope sealed in red wax, the mark of the Langfords, the wealthiest family in the region. Amina froze, pulse racing. She had never known anyone named Langford. "I think you have the wrong person." "No." Ethan met her eyes. "He spoke your name, and he expects your answer before noon tomorrow." He turned to leave, but something made him hesitate. He glanced toward the doorway and caught sight of Aunt Helen's curled body inside. His gaze eased just a little. A moment. No more. Yet it tightened something in Amina's chest. He mounted his horse again, but looked back once more, his eyes deeper now, almost urging her. "Read it. Your life is turning." When the hoofbeats faded down the dusty road, Amina stood still. The letter in her hand felt heavy as a stone lodged beneath her ribs. Inside, her hands shook too much to break the seal. When she finally managed it, the first line turned her cold. "I, Silas Langford, age 42, request that Miss Amina Walker become my lawful wife within the next month. In return, I will cover all medical expenses for your aunt and secure your future after my passing. I suffer from severe heart disease and do not have long." She read the letter again and again, every word cutting deeper. Lawful wife. Heir. Time is short. She looked up at her aunt fighting for breath. Wind pressed through the cracks of the roof, and she knew her life had been pushed toward a crossroads no young woman should face, and she would have to consider the choice no one her age should ever be forced to make. The road to Langford Estate was longer than Amina expected. The ground was dry and cracked, dust rising behind each step of the horse. Ethan Hale rode ahead, keeping a measured distance, as though guiding someone he knew was about to enter a world far removed from her old life. Amina sat in the worn carriage Ethan had prepared. She held a small bag, everything she owned besides a few scraps of fabric and Aunt Helen's tattered Bible. Dust settled on her hair and hands the whole way, but she barely noticed. The words from the strange letter echoed in her mind. A proposal she still couldn't decide was salvation or a new shackle. When the carriage stopped at the gates of Langford Estate, she held her breath. Before her stood a vast stretch of land, trees lining the road, and a stone residence bright against the valley. It was grand in a way she had never seen. Beautiful, yet cold. A place built to show power, not to raise a family. Ethan opened the door and offered his hand. The brief warmth of that touch startled her, but he let go at once, refusing even a moment of closeness. "He's waiting in the west parlor," Ethan said quietly, his voice softer than the day before. Amina nodded and followed him through the wide hall that seemed to swallow her steps. Silas Langford sat on a long chair near the window, the afternoon light stretching his thin frame like a weary shadow. At their approach, he turned. Amina's breath caught. He wasn't what she imagined. Not a proud man, not the force behind a vast estate. He looked worn, eyes darkened by illness, expression caught between resolve and surrender. "Miss Walker," he said, voice low and rough, each word carrying strain. "Thank you for coming." She bowed her head, heart pounding. Langford coughed, held himself steady, then continued. "I assume Ethan told you some of it. I don't have much time. The doctor says I should prepare for the worst." Her fingers pressed into her skirt. I'm sorry, Mr. Langford." He shook his head. "Don't pity me. What I need is to keep this estate from falling into the hands of greedy kin. You don't know them, Amina. They'll tear apart every acre, every dollar. I need a lawful heir before I die. My child, if you agree, will be protected from all of them." He paused, meeting her gaze, sharp but tired. "I chose you because you belong to no faction. You're honest. And," he exhaled heavily, "I believe you would raise the child better than anyone around me." Amina's chest trembled. She had never imagined bearing the child of a man she had only just met. But the promise of medical care for Aunt Helen. She couldn't turn away. Silence stretched between them. At last, she tightened her grip on her skirt and bowed her head. "I accept, sir." Langford closed his eyes briefly, relief settling across his shoulders. He didn't smile, but the weight on him eased. The ceremony took place that afternoon. A tired minister stood behind a wooden table. Ethan, the only witness. No flowers, no music, no feast. Just two strangers signing what fate had placed in front of them. Amina couldn't see her future, only the rise and fall of Langford's strained breath beside her. That first night in the estate, she was shown to a separate room, too wide, too cold, too quiet compared to the dirt house she'd lived in all her life. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, steadying her breath. When she finally stood to close the door, she noticed something placed on the threshold. A thick brown blanket, folded neatly, set where she would see it at once. No note, no knock, only a small gesture. But it tightened her throat. A dying man had remembered she would be cold in this stone room. She sat down again, drawing the blanket to her chest, as if holding a promise unspoken, that in this contracted marriage, perhaps there was still a trace of kindness left to carry her through. The early days at Langford Estate passed with an unusual stillness, as if the wide stone house was watching Amina, waiting to see whether she had the strength to survive inside it. The halls stretched so far that her footsteps echoed back at her like those of someone else. Thick walls, tall windows rising near the ceiling, everything too vast, too quiet, forcing her to remind herself she no longer lived in the small dirt home where Aunt Helen struggled for breath. In the mornings, Ethan led her through the rooms so she could learn her way. By afternoon, Amina wandered alone, trying to grow familiar with each turn. The house did not reject her, but it did not welcome her either. It simply stayed silent, much like its master. Silas Langford appeared rarely. He spent most hours in the library or his study, where dim light mixed with the smell of old paper and medicine. Yet even when he kept his distance, Amina felt his gaze on her now and then, as if he wanted to be certain she wouldn't be frightened into leaving. One morning while she washed dishes in the large kitchen, a cup slipped from her hand. She reached for it, but not fast enough. A steady hand caught the rim just before it hit the floor. Amina startled, looking up, straight into Langford's eyes. Their hands touched briefly, lightly, enough to stop her breath. "It breaks easily," he said, voice low and rough with fatigue. She pulled her hand back faster than she meant to. "I'm sorry. I'll be more careful." He didn't scold her. He set the cup on the table and walked away, his quiet steps leaving a weight she couldn't name. A small moment, but it unsettled her in a way she didn't understand. At lunch, she was invited to sit at the dining table for the first time. The table was long enough that one misplaced seat would leave them unable to hear each other. But that day, Langford sat closer than she expected, only 2 chairs away. He ate little, his thin hands trembling faintly as he held his utensils. Amina glanced at him, then lowered her gaze at once when she met his eyes, quick as sunlight breaking on wood. Neither spoke, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like 2 people trying to learn how to breathe in the same room. At the end of the meal, Langford set his utensils down and leaned back. "You can read, can't you?" he asked. Amina nodded. "Yes, sir, but I'm not fast." He nodded once, rising with the slow effort of someone older than his years. "I need you to read a few documents, so when I'm gone, you'll know how to manage this land." Her throat tightened. His words did not sound like duty. They felt like preparation, as though he meant to leave her something steadier than a marriage contract. Afternoons stretched with them seated across from each other in the library. Langford wrote notes with a slight tremor in his hand. Amina read about land boundaries, crop taxes, and barley harvest seasons. Whenever she frowned at a line, he leaned closer, pointing to the text. His coat brushed her arm, a thin, fleeting warmth, a closeness neither of them mentioned. His coughing worsened. Some days he bent over so hard that a trace of red stained his handkerchief. Amina noticed, though he tried to hide it. She didn't question him. She simply brought warm water, set it within reach, and said quietly, "Rest a moment. I'll read this part for you." Langford looked at her longer than he needed to, not like a master watching a servant, but like a man long accustomed to darkness, suddenly touched by light and unsure how to stand in it. One evening, as Amina arranged books back onto the shelves, Langford stepped inside. His breath was heavy, but his eyes gentler than usual. He held a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn. He offered it to her. "This was Eleanor's, my late wife's. She wrote down how she kept this house. I think it might help you breathe easier in a place this large." Amina took it, her hand trembling. It wasn't just a journal. It was the first door he had opened, letting her step into the quiet center of his life. She lifted her eyes to him. This time he didn't look away. Stillness, but no longer distance. In the days after Amina received Eleanor's journal, the air inside Langford Estate shifted. The cautious distance was gone, along with the sidelong glances. A new kind of silence settled between them. Lower, steadier, as if the great house itself sensed the way their breaths were slowly falling into rhythm. Each morning, Amina read Eleanor's notes on caring for a man with a failing heart. Each afternoon, she sat in the library beside Langford, light falling through the tall windows in uneven patches across the wooden table. Langford read slowly, and Amina carried the next lines whenever his coughing forced him to stop. She began noticing small things, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he pressed his lips together when pain struck without warning, the slight tremor in his hands when the weather turned cold. And that night, she happened to see him clutch his chest as he stepped out of the library. He tried to keep his composure, but his fingers dug into the table edge, white from strain. Amina ran to him. "Are you hurting?" she asked, voice shaking, her hand landing on his arm before she realized it. Langford forced a steady breath and waved her off gently. "Only tired. It will pass." But the pain didn't pass as quickly as he said. His shoulders tightened, eyes shut hard, breath catching in uneven pulls. Amina helped him into a chair, her hand on his back, feeling each heavy breath as if he were fighting the whole world. He said nothing more. She didn't ask. They simply sat close under the yellow lamp, two people alone in a house too large. The next day brought rain. Cold wind slipped through the window frames. Langford tried to read the expense ledger, but his eyes stayed fixed on the page without seeing it. Amina set a cup of ginger tea on the table. He looked up, his gaze softer than usual. "Thank you." She sat a little distance away, but Langford motioned her closer, easier for conversation. The warm cup between them felt like a small bridge. After a long pause, he spoke in a low voice. "I once had a family. Or, at least I believed I did. My parents died early. I had relatives, people who cared more for land than for flesh and blood. Eleanor was the only person in my life who wanted nothing from me. She died of illness at 23. Since then," he stopped to draw a long breath, "I've had no one beside me." Amina listened, her chest tightening as if she carried the ache for him. "I understand that feeling, sir," she said quietly. "My childhood wasn't easy. When my parents passed, Aunt Helen raised me. But besides her, people looked at me differently because of my skin. They didn't beat me, didn't curse me, just the looks. Looks that make you fold yourself small like a shadow." Langford tilted his head, studying her long enough that she had to look away. "You're stronger than you think, Amina." His words were soft, but they struck deep. That afternoon, a small thing happened. so small that another person might have missed it. But for two souls long used to solitude, it was enough to make time pause. They reached for the same book on the shelf. Amina's hand brushed his, cold meeting warm, like two streams touching. She pulled back, but Langford didn't withdraw at once. He held the moment, just one brief beat, before letting go. The fragile instant left a quiet ache in her chest. That evening, after the sun had gone down, Langford and Amina sat at a small table by the window. Outside, mist clung to the glass like a thin veil. He stared out for a long time before speaking, voice low and soft enough that she had to lean in to hear. If I had more time, I would start over, from the beginning. Not with a contract. Not with death chasing me. Amina raised her eyes. The look he gave her was no longer that of a master toward a contracted wife. It was the look of a man reaching toward something he knew he could not have, yet choosing to be honest anyway. Her heart stilled for a beat. Warmth and ache spread through her chest. She said nothing. She didn't know what to say. The silence between them stretched long enough to speak for them both. A silence heavier than any touch, gentler than any confession. And from that moment on, something new began forming in the great house. Quiet, slow, unhurried. Just two solitary hearts, finding each other in the stillness. The storm struck just as the sun slipped behind the ridge. Wind hammered the windows like angry fists, thunder rolling across the stone roof. Langford Estate sank into a roar Amina had never grown used to. But that night, it wasn't the thunder that made her tremble. It was Langford's cold, motionless body on the long chair in the library. Their earlier conversation had barely ended when he suddenly gripped the table, breath breaking, eyes darkening. Amina rushed to him, heart splitting as his hand slipped from hers. Ethan and two houseworkers helped carry him to his bed. When they left, Amina stayed beside him, her hand wrapped around his thin, weak one. All night, he lay there, pale, struggling, every breath a final fight. And Amina stayed with him, eyes wide, not resting for even a minute. She wiped sweat from his brow, lifted his head for sips of water. Her hands shook whenever he groaned from the sharp pain in his chest. The hours stretched like a lifetime, and Amina felt her own heart tighten with every broken breath of his. Near dawn, as the storm began to fade, Langford's eyes opened. "Amina." His voice was nothing more than a whisper of wind. She leaned close at once. "I'm here. Don't be afraid." He searched for her hand. His fingers were cold, trembling hard, yet still tried to hold hers. After a long pause, he forced out the words, "I'm not afraid to die." He stopped to breathe, chest heaving with pain. "I'm only afraid of leaving you in this house, alone." The words cut straight through her, warm and painful at once, deep enough to steal her breath. She didn't know when her tears began falling, but they kept falling, as if all the strength she had held together for days suddenly gave way. She held his hand tight. "Mr. Silas, I'm not a stranger anymore. I'm ready to be your wife. Not because of the contract, not because of duty, but truly I'm here. I want to be here. With you." Langford looked at her. For a long time. His eyes, worn and hurting, softened with a gentleness she had never seen, as if no one in his life had ever said such words to him. He raised his other hand and touched her cheek. For the first time, a touch steady, without hesitation. Only honesty. "Amina," he whispered. "Thank you." There was no ceremony, no vow. But in that quiet room, with only the last breath of storm outside, two people wrapped in pain and long years of loss stepped toward each other. No contract, no distance, no coldness of a marriage written in ink instead of feeling. Only two scarred hearts realizing they could still grow warm. And on a night when the storm died, they found each other. When Langford regained a little strength, he pulled Amina closer. His breath was weak, but his eyes held a clarity that seemed to memorize every line of her face. Amina placed her hand on his chest, over the heart fighting for its last days. The warmth beneath her palm reached her in a thin, real line. Neither spoke. Silence was enough. A night of closeness, slow, steady, free of desire's haste, free of turmoil. Only two people giving each other what little they had left. Closeness, trust, and a soft, nameless thing neither dared to call love. By morning, the storm had fully passed. Pale sunlight slipped through the window, laying a soft gold across the bed. Amina rested against his chest, breath steady after a sleepless night. She held his hand, afraid he would disappear the moment she let go. Langford did not sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, a faint smile crossing his face. Not because he felt stronger, but because he knew he had touched something he never thought he'd have again. A quiet night, beside the woman he loved in silence. And in that very moment he understood. His time was truly running out. The days after the storm softened into a thin, pale light. Amina often woke before Langford, watching him sleep, his face hollow, yet peaceful in a way she had never seen on him before. She held his hand each time he stirred, afraid that if she let go he might slip away into the gray morning. One early dawn, as she stepped into the kitchen to prepare breakfast, dizziness struck. A wave of nausea hit her hard, sudden as cold water. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing slow, trying to steady herself. It wasn't the first time it had happened in recent days. She had simply forced herself to ignore it, blaming exhaustion or lack of rest. But this morning felt different. There was something strange, as if her body was whispering a secret her mind hadn't dared to name. When Ethan walked in, he noticed her face grow pale. "Are you all right?" he asked, a real worry in his voice. Amina forced a small smile and avoided his eyes. "I'm only a little lightheaded." But when he left, she sank into a wooden chair, both hands pressed to her lower belly, and she realized the warm flutter there was unlike anything she'd felt before. She thought about it all day, unable to focus on even the smallest task. Only near dusk, sitting in Eleanor's sewing room, did she rest her hand on her belly again and whisper the truth she already knew. "Perhaps there's a child." When Langford returned from the stables with slow, tired steps, he found Amina waiting at the library door. Her eyes trembled. Her hands were clasped tight. Not with fear, but with something softer, more fragile, something that struck him before he understood it. She stepped closer, close enough that he could hear her light breaths. "I have something to tell you." He braced himself on the table, his face pale after a long day. "Amina, what is it?" His voice shifted when he saw her hand rest gently over her stomach. He straightened. His eyes widened. His breath tightened in his chest. "I think," she said slowly, as if afraid the words might break. "I think I am with child." A long, aching silence fell between them. Langford didn't speak, didn't draw a full breath, didn't move. Only his eyes, so used to darkness, so accustomed to loss, suddenly lit with a quiet shock that tightened her throat. He lifted his hand, trembling, but he stopped midway, as though the moment was too delicate to touch. "Amina," he whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know what to say." She gave him a small, steady smile. "You don't need to." Then, drawn by something neither could deny, Langford placed his trembling hand on her belly. A gesture simple enough, yet it felt to Amina like a promise deeper than any contract ever written. He closed his eyes, and a single tear slid down his cheek. For the first time in years, Langford cried not from pain, but because he had found something to live for. In the days that followed, the change in him was clear, not loud, not dramatic, only small things, things only Amina noticed. Fresh fruit on the table each morning, though it was hard to find this season. Tonic bottles placed neatly by the window, arranged with his own hands. A soft wool blanket left beside her bed when the night wind turned cold. He never said any of it was for the child. He simply did it, as a man willing to spend whatever strength he had left protecting the last piece of family he would ever have. They began sitting closer in the library. When pain overtook him, Amina leaned against his shoulder, feeling his breath grow heavy, then ease with her presence. Sometimes he placed his palm over her belly without speaking. Sometimes she held his hand, feeling his heartbeat beneath thin fabric. Their love had no vows, no declarations. Only the quiet understanding of two people who knew time was not on their side. And because of that, every minute mattered. That evening, the sky turned the color of old gold. Amina went outside to find Langford, worried when he didn't come to lunch. She walked along the row of chestnut trees, one hand resting on her belly, a restless flutter in her chest. Near the center of the yard, she saw him. Langford stood at a distance, one hand on the porch pillar, his shoulder sagging. He tried to steady himself, but only a breath later. His body collapsed to the ground. "Silas!" Amina screamed, running as if the earth had vanished beneath her feet. She dropped to her knees, lifting his head into her arms, her hands shaking uncontrollably. His breath was so faint it was almost gone. "Silas, please, don't." Her tears fell onto his face, hot as fire. Across the wide yard, the wind carried her desperate cry, but it wasn't strong enough to carry away the terror tightening around her heart. That night, the storm returned after weeks of calm. Wind slammed against the windows, thunder rolling across the dark sky. Langford Estate flickered under pale flashes, as though the land itself sensed what was coming. Amina woke to a sharp tightening in her belly. At first she thought it was another routine cramp, but within minutes her breath hitched, her whole body trembling under waves of pain that came too fast to catch. She held the edge of the bed, hand on her stomach, frightened, yet steadier than she expected. "It's time," she whispered, as wind hissed through the cracks. She called for Ethan. Footsteps rushed down the hallway. The household stirred, bringing water, cloths, preparing the room. But the first name she called was not theirs. Get Silas. Please, bring him. Ethan hesitated. Langford was still weak from the collapse, but he nodded and ran. In his room, Langford struggled to sit when he heard frantic knocking and Ethan's breathless voice. She's in labor, sir. Langford pushed himself upright. His legs failed at once. Pain from the fall burned deep in his bones. I need to be there. You shouldn't help me up. His voice was faint, but firm with the resolve of a man facing the last moments of his life. Ethan didn't argue. He carried Langford down the dim hallway. Twice Langford fell to his knees, breath caught in his chest. Yet he stood again, eyes glassy with pain and fear that he would be too late. I must be with her. Amina lay on the bed, sweat shining across her brow. When the door opened and Langford's figure appeared in the lightning's white glow, her heart clenched for a reason beyond pain. He could barely stand, leaning hard on Ethan's shoulder. Yet the moment he saw her, he pushed forward on his own. Amina! She broke into tears, not from the labor but from the sight of him, fragile, shaking, yet coming to her as if answering a vow he had never spoken aloud. I'm here, he said, voice strained. I won't leave. Not now. She gripped his hand with every ounce of strength she had left. The room filled with groans and rain pounding hard against the roof. The midwife urged her through each contraction, while Langford sat pressed beside her, his hand locked in hers. Amina, look at me, he said through fractured breaths. You can do this. You're strong. But he was the one trembling from the deep agony crushing his chest. They held on to each other through every wave of pain. And then, after a cry that tore through storm and thunder, a child's wail rose. A red, wrinkled baby boy was placed into Amina's arms, his eyes squeezed shut, his cry louder than anything else in the cold room. Amina sobbed, clutching him close. But Langford, he went still. He reached out with a trembling hand, touching the child's cheek, then resting his fingers over the tiny chest that rose and fell with fierce new life. Malcolm, he whispered, gathering every last breath into the name. Malcolm Langford. It was a name he gave with all that remained of him. Hours later, as Amina drifted in and out of exhausted sleep with the baby in her arms, Langford stayed in the chair beside them, fighting to remain conscious. One hand on the cradle, the other holding hers. But the pain, this time it was different. Deeper, heavier, as if his heart had nothing left to give. He tried to stand and call for help, but his legs wouldn't move. His breath thinned into broken gasps. Amina woke just as he collapsed sideways, his hand slipping from hers. Silas! Silas! She caught him, gathering his head into her lap, tears spilling like something torn loose deep inside her. Ethan and the others ran in, but Langford no longer heard any of them. He looked at Amina one last time, lying in her arms, like a man who had wandered too far through life to know peace, until this final moment. Amina, he breathed out once, soft, like a man who had finally found home. That breath was his last. Amina held him close, crying into the hollow between storm and dawn, her grief rising with the wind outside, as though the sky itself bowed over a parting too beautiful and too painful for words. By the next morning, the storm was gone, but the sky over Langford Estate stayed heavy and gray, as if the land itself knew a man had left this world during the night. Silas's funeral was quiet, true to the way he had lived. No procession, no long line of carriages, only a few loyal servants, Ethan, the town's old minister, and Amina, standing beside the small cradle where Malcolm slept, unaware he had lost the father he would never remember. Amina wore a simple black dress the housekeeper found for her. Her hair was tied back, her face drawn from grief and sleepless hours, but her eyes, still steady, not from strength, but because she had no choice except to stand. When the coffin was lowered, Amina did not cry. She had wept through the entire night, until she thought she had nothing left. She simply laid her hand on the wooden lid, brushing it lightly, as if touching the warmth of the man who had held her hand through those brief, precious months. "Goodbye, Silas," she whispered, softer than the wind. But the quiet of the funeral lasted only until afternoon, when the Langford relatives arrived. Fine coats, wide-brimmed hats, faces arranged in momentary sympathy before greed rose sharp beneath the surface. "Who is this girl? When did she marry him? A black widow? Here, in Langford Estate? We must review the papers." They looked at Amina as if she were an intruder in a home that could never belong to her. They looked at Malcolm as if he were a child unworthy of the Langford name. One distant relative said it outright. "You can't expect us to believe a young colored girl just happened to inherit an entire empire." Amina gripped her skirt, but she did not bow her head. The words stung, but not more than the years she had endured the quiet cruelty of such looks. Ethan stepped forward, anger tightening his expression. "Mr. Langford signed a legal marriage contract. The estate and the land are clearly willed. Mrs. Langford, Amina, and her son Malcolm are the rightful heirs." Silence fell. Every eye turned toward Amina, this time not only with disdain, but with bitterness, because they knew they had lost. Amina said nothing. She didn't need to. The law and Silas's own hand stood with hers. When the relatives left, leaving behind a room stretched tight with resentment, Amina returned to the library, where Silas had spent hours, where he had drawn his final breaths. On the desk sat a small wooden box. The housekeeper said Silas had prepared it weeks earlier, instructing it be given to Amina at the right time. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were 2 letters tied with rough twine, one with her name, one marked, "For my son." She opened her own first. Silas's handwriting was shaky, slanted, yet each stroke carried the effort of a man trying to write as straight as he could. "Amina, if you are reading this, I am no longer with you. Life has been unfair to place so much on your shoulders. But thank you for bringing light back into this house. I thought I would end my life in loneliness. You made these last months the best I have ever known. If there is a next life, I would want to find you first. Silas." Amina pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sob, but the tears came anyway, hot and unsteady. She opened the second letter, a letter for Malcolm, the child who would grow up without a father's arms around him. "My son, I don't know if you will look like me or your mother, but I hope you have her heart, for it is the finest thing I ever knew. I could not stay to lead you over the hills, to show you the sky, or teach you how to listen to the land. But remember this, you were not born from a bargain. You came from the best thing this world ever offered me. You were wanted. You were loved. Father." Amina held both letters to her chest and wept. Not the tears of despair, but the tears of someone who finally understood she had truly been loved, and must now live on to protect that love. Beside her, Malcolm stirred in his cradle. She bent, kissing his forehead. "My son, we have no one but each other now. But I won't let anyone take away what your father left for us." Outside, the wind had stilled. The great house remained cold, but within Amina, a small light had begun to burn. Word that Amina was the lawful heir to all of Langford Estate swept through Ridgewell Valley like wind across dry grass. Folks talked, sometimes out of harmless curiosity, sometimes with doubt sharp enough to sting. But for the Langford family, the news wasn't just upsetting. It was an insult. 2 weeks after the funeral, the official complaint arrived. They accused Amina of manipulating a sick man, seducing him for inheritance, and fabricating the marriage. The charges were written in cold ink, pushing her into another storm while she was still fighting postpartum pain and long nights spent caring for Malcolm. She held the lawsuit with hands still trembling from childbirth. But her eyes did not tremble, not because she was strong, but because she no longer had the right to be weak. The trial opened on a cold, damp spring morning. The sky hung low over Ridgewell, thin as a faded cloth. Amina wore a plain black dress, Malcolm wrapped in the soft blanket the housekeeper had sewn for him. She walked into the courthouse with slow, steady steps, as if each brick underfoot still remembered Silas's warmth. The Langford relatives sat in a long row, their faces as rigid as stone. They stared at her with a contempt she had known since childhood. But now, that contempt no longer reached the softest part of her. Ethan sat behind her, silent, but the tilt of his head told her she wasn't alone. The judge read the file, voice firm and echoing through the wooden chamber like hooves striking hard ground. "Mrs. Amina Langford, please speak." Amina rose. The room went still. She opened the journal tied with rough twine, the one Silas had written in his final months. Inside were shaky lines, but each one filled with intent. The date of their marriage, his reasons for the will, and every instruction for her after his death. She didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't plead. Her voice was the calm voice of a woman who had walked through birth and death, and knew the only thing she had to protect now was her son. "Your Honor," she said, each word steady. "My husband prepared everything. This was his will, not for me, for his son, Malcolm." She rested her hand on the small cradle before her. "I do not ask anyone to believe me. I only ask that the court honor what he wrote. And," she lifted her gaze, calm enough to quiet the entire room, "that the law be followed." A few relatives scoffed, but the judge silenced them with a single stern look. The family's lawyer tried to paint Amina as an opportunist, but every accusation he raised was met with Silas's own handwriting, notes on his health, the date of the wedding, his words describing Amina as the kindest soul ever to live in this house. By midday, the judge closed the file, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Langford Estate is the lawful property of Malcolm Langford, the sole child of the late Silas Langford, and the legal guardian, with full rights and decision-making authority, is Mrs. Amina Langford." The gavel struck, a sound like fate sealing its verdict. The Langford relatives erupted in protest, but the decision was final. Amina stood for a long moment. She didn't raise her hands or cry out. She only bowed her head and held Malcolm to her chest, as if to tell him, "From today on, you are safe." That afternoon, as Amina stepped out of the courthouse, the people of Ridgewell lined the street. Gone were the curious looks that followed her when she first arrived. Gone were the murmurs about her skin or her place in the world. They looked at her now as they would look at a mother who had walked through fire and feared nothing that could hurt her anymore. An older woman bowed her head as Amina passed. A man removed his hat. The eyes that met hers held no pity. They held respect. Amina gave a small, quiet smile. Then she tightened her hold on Malcolm and began the walk up the road toward Langford Estate. A road that once frightened her. A road she once wished to turn back from. Today, it was the road of a mother who had turned to steel. Not because she chose it, but because life left her no other choice. The first years after the trial were the years Amina learned to stand without a single hand left to lean on. Langford Estate was vast but quiet as an empty shell. At times, when night sank deep and wind slipped through the long corridors, she felt as though she could hear Silas breathing somewhere, breath no longer belonging to this world. But that emptiness reminded her of the last promise she made: to keep this land, not for its name but for the soul of the man who had trusted her with his final strength. Amina started with small things. First, she cleared the old storage barn along the hillside. Then she opened a small infirmary, using the little money she had and the notes Eleanor once wrote on caring for the sick. Folks in Ridgewell Valley, too poor to travel far for treatment, began to come. One summer afternoon, as Amina wrapped the hand of a child who had fallen, the mother whispered through tears, "No one in this valley has ever helped us like this, Mrs. Langford." Amina shook her head. "Call me Amina. I'm only doing what Silas wanted done." After that, people called the place by a simple name: the Langford Aid House. The first winter after Malcolm learned to walk, the snow ran deep. Families in the valley struggled to find enough to eat. Remembering the nights Silas spoke of old winters that once claimed too many lives, Amina made her choice. She opened the storehouse. No hesitation, no calculations. She sent out grain, potatoes, dried porridge, and firewood, handing them out in the wide yard. At first, many were afraid to accept it. A young widow, a black woman, holding all of Langford wealth, folks still carried some caution. But when they saw Malcolm chasing snowflakes at her feet, and her quiet smile as she placed food into their hands, they understood that kindness didn't need proof. An old man touched her hand, trembling. "Child, Ridgewell owes you." Amina bowed her head. She knew this wasn't her doing alone. It was her way of giving back to the land, and telling Silas she remembered what he once wished for this valley. As Malcolm grew, he followed Amina everywhere, into the infirmary, to the stables, or out to the slope where she planted the wildflowers Silas used to like. The boy had his mother's bright eyes, but the way he watched the world in quiet reminded her of his father. Once, standing in the summer field, Malcolm asked, "Mama, is this my father's land?" Amina nodded. "Yes, he loved it, and someday you will understand why." He placed his small hand over hers. "I'll keep it, the way you keep me." Amina held him close. In that simple promise was a gentle steadiness that felt just like Silas, something no one had taught, something he seemed born with. When Malcolm turned 6, Amina opened a small school on the site of the old eastern barn. She used her savings to hire carpenters to mend the walls, set a roof, then brought in a young teacher from the nearby town to teach the valley's children. On the first day of school, Amina stood at the door, Malcolm leaning against her leg, watching the children run inside. She said nothing, but deep within, she knew this was what Silas would have wanted most. A place once filled with dispute, now echoed with children's laughter. The small school, the small infirmary, the winter rations, the summer days she led the children up the hill to tell them the land's history. Together, they became the legacy she built with her own hands. Not with power, not with lineage, but with compassion. The thing that filled the hollow space Silas's death had left behind. Malcolm grew in a home where love was never absent. He learned that his father had lived quietly, died quietly, yet left behind a legacy louder than any name. Kindness. Each night, Amina sat on the long bench by the window, Malcolm asleep across her lap. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant insects. She looked over the moonlit field stretching to the horizon and felt the weight of the promise she had made to Silas as he lay dying. "I'll keep this place. For you." And she kept it. With her youth. With the quiet strength she had learned from the man who gave her his last, truest trust. 18 years passed in Ridgewell Valley, not fast, yet not slow. Time moved the way grass grew, withered and rose again, steady and quiet as the breath of the land. By the time Amina realized how far those seasons had carried her, Malcolm stood a full head taller than she was, his shoulders broader than the father he knew only through letters and stories. Malcolm Langford, a young man with steady eyes, disciplined living, and a mindset on studying law. He never chose it to gain wealth or show off, but to understand the days his mother once stood before a court alone, holding him, no more than a red-faced newborn, while facing an entire family intent on taking everything. He said simply, "I want to stand firm, Mama, so you won't have to do everything alone anymore." Amina often looked at him with quiet pride and wonder. He carried her gentleness, yet the deep silence in him, the way he observed before speaking, belonged to Silas, a quieter echo of the father he never met. On the day Malcolm graduated from law school, Amina kept a soft smile through the ceremony. But when he walked to her, placed the cap on his own head, and stood before her in his robe, something pulled tight in her chest. He whispered low enough for only her to hear, "Mama, I did it." Amina touched his cheek. "You were always going to, Malcolm." That evening, when they returned to Langford Estate, lit warm in celebration of its young heir, Amina finally did something she had hesitated over for years. She brought the old wooden box from the library down to the sitting room. Malcolm stared at it for a long moment. The box was worn enough that a touch stirred a thin cloud of dust, yet the string binding it was neat, preserved as though watched over for nearly 2 decades. "This is..." Amina sat down, her movements slow, as if she were turning the pages of her own youth. "Your father's letters. One for me, and one for you. I've kept them for 18 years, waiting for the day you were old enough to understand them." Malcolm said nothing. He sat across from her, bowing his head toward the box, as though before something sacred. Amina pushed it gently toward him. Malcolm opened the letter addressed to him first. Silas's handwriting wavered and dulled with time, but Malcolm read each line as if the man's voice crossed the years to reach him. "My son, if you are reading this, you are older now than when I left this world. I am sorry I could not hold your hand as you learned to walk, nor stand beside you in your first days of life. But know this. You are not the weight of a bargain. You are the most beautiful thing ever given to me. I loved your mother, in ways I never learned to speak aloud while I lived. And I loved you, in the way a man loves a child he he knows he will never live long enough to see become good. Live right. Love your mother well, and guard this land as you would guard the spirit of our whole family. Father, bye. The final lines. Malcolm's hands trembled. Not from shock, but because it was the first time in his life he felt his father's hand, not on his shoulder, but somewhere deep inside his chest. He set the letter down, covered his face with both hands, and let out a quiet sob. Amina said nothing. She moved to him, laid her palm on his thick dark hair, the same gentle touch she once gave Silas on the storm-struck night he died. After a long while, Malcolm looked up, his eyes red. "Mama, he really loved you, didn't he?" She smiled, a smile Malcolm had never seen before, tired but peaceful, like someone who had lived long enough to keep a promise to the one they loved. "Yes, your father loved me, but he didn't have time to say enough. So I spent the rest of my life making sure you would know." They sat on the porch until the moon rose high. The Ridgewell wind swept across the steps, carrying the scent of dry grass and the chirp of insects calling from far fields. Amina told him the fragments of life she had kept tucked away, the first touch in the library, the blanket he left at her door, the nights filled with pain and quiet tenderness. Malcolm listened without interruption. He realized he was hearing not only the story of a father, but the story of a love that had saved an entire piece of land. "Mama, I promise I'll keep his word." Amina looked at him and saw in his eyes not only Malcolm, but Silas, Eleanor, herself, and all of Langford Estate standing behind them. A legacy passed from one pair of hands to the next. 20 years had passed since the day Amina held newborn Malcolm in her arms and laid Silas to rest in the earth. Time had touched every corner of Langford Estate. The trees taller, the road smoother, and the once cold stone house now filled each afternoon with the laughter of neighborhood children running through the yard. Amina stood on the high ridge covered in early spring grass. This was where Silas used to stand, shoulders slightly bowed, hands clasped behind his back, looking over the land he had spent a lifetime protecting. Now, at 40, she stood in the same place but with a different breath, lighter, deeper, unafraid. From this hill, Langford Estate opened before her like a book. The main house, the infirmary, the small school, the community garden, the granaries she had built over the years. Every place carried a piece of her life. Struggle, loss, rebuilding, and finally, peace. Down below, Malcolm was helping workers measure the southern stables for repair. The skinny boy she once carried through winter snow had become a tall, steady man with his father's quiet gaze. In 2 weeks, he would marry. A gentle young schoolteacher from town, strong in the way Ridgewell people needed to be. Amina watched him, and a slow smile rose on her lips. Not the grand kind born of pride, but the quiet smile of someone who knows her life has reached a fullness that leaves no room for regret. That evening, Malcolm stepped into her room with his suit jacket draped over his arm. "Mama, I think this one's a bit tight. Can you check?" Amina straightened the collar for him. Simple movements, yet within them she saw an entire journey. The child she once rocked through winter storms, now a man ready to build a home of his own. "You're like your father in this," she murmured, smoothing his shoulder. "Like him how?" Malcolm asked, head tilted. "In the way," she paused, looking into his eyes. "You're careful with everything you do, even standing in front of a mirror." Your father was the same. But when it came to protecting someone, neither of you were ever as fragile as people believed. Malcolm smiled, lowering his gaze. Under the golden lamplight, his face was a quiet blend of her and Silas, woven together in a way time could not separate. "Mama," Malcolm said softly, voice thickening, "I know he was proud of you." Amina was silent for a moment. Then she nodded, without shedding a tear. Some tears had already been spent 20 years ago. The rest had settled into a calmer place inside her. "I'm proud of him too, Malcolm. He didn't live long, but he lived true." When night fell, wind rose from the valley carrying the scent of young grass and the faint murmur of the creek far below. Amina returned to the ridge once more. Beneath her feet, the shadow of Langford Estate stretched long and warm, no longer a place that frightened her or made her feel small. She sat down and laid her hand on the taughten earth. The soil was soft and warm, holding the memory of the man who had turned her life from fear into fullness. Amina closed her eyes. In the quiet sounds of the night, she heard old echoes, the creak of the library door, Silas's low voice reading documents to her, the first time he spoke their son's name, and his final breath, soft as wind. She opened her eyes to the wide night sky, a dark ribbon stretching endless above. "Silas," she whispered, "look, I kept every promise you asked of me, and even the ones you didn't have time to speak." A breeze lifted her dress, gentle as the hand that once touched her cheek in his last days. Not strong, not urgent, just a soft blessing sent from somewhere far beyond. Amina stood and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Her life had not been long, nor easy, but it was full. Full enough that when she looked back, nothing needed rewriting. She walked down the hill, toward the house where Malcolm waited, toward the future still stretching ahead, and toward the new family soon to be born. Behind her, the wind rose again, as if offering its quiet blessing from the one who had left this world long ago. To all the elders watching tonight, each of us has known someone who's gone ahead, yet left their warmth lingering in the wind. If today's story touched a memory of your own, I welcome you to share it below so we can walk through it together. And if you'd like to hear more gentle, healing love stories like this one, please remember to like, subscribe, and share with those you care for. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.